All right, welcome everybody. We like to get together to kind of discuss some of the current events, some of the current happenings in education. And so I'm going to just introduce myself and then have my brothers introduce themselves. My name is Quan Nellums. I'm an educator within the city of Detroit. Now school counselor for the past 2 years. Uh, Founder of InDemand. And I'm passing the mic to Kente.
Brother Quan, thank you, man, for this invitation. My fellas, good to see y'all, man. Kente Rosser, 16 years in the business, a profession of education. I'm happy to be here, part of this discussion, to lend my thoughts and ideas to problem solve some of the concerns that we have that exist today. Brother Wallace, you up?
Thank you, Quan, again. Rod Wallace, this is my 21st year. In August, this will be my 21st year in education. Served in many roles: administrator, teacher, currently program director for EMU Upper Bound, and I'm honored to be here.
All right, my name is Brian Ferguson Bay. This is my 14th year, I think 13th, 14th year in education, somewhere around there. Harper Woods School District right now, currently teaching 7th grade world history. I'm honored to be here as well with my brothers from InDemand, and we're here to bring about that change that is sorely needed in our communities. Go ahead, Brother Dandridge.
So, Dewan Dandridge, I am the CEO at Black Leaders Detroit, Detroit-based nonprofit, also husband, father, and mentor in the city of Detroit. And I'm also honored to be here, excited to get the conversation started.
All right, so here we are. I mean, we've experienced, we talked about this quite a bit. We've experienced maybe 2 decades worth of change within the past 3 months, from COVID-19 to the current going on in America, dealing with police brutality, with the huge outcry across the world for justice when it comes to police brutality and how Black people are dealt with, not only in America, but worldwide. And so today we just kind of want to discuss, like, how is all the things that's going on, how, as Black men, how are we processing it, first of all? But secondly, what are the implications in education as well for all these things that's going on as well? So since Brother Mr. Wallace generated these questions, man, I want you to kind of, read off the questions, man, and then we'll go at it. You good with that, Rod?
Yeah, you want me to do them one by one?
Let's do them one by one, bro.
Okay. So just in terms of framing the context with which we're operating, obviously because of the incidents that have happened involving the police and African American men and women recently, because we can't downplay the impact that affected Breonna Taylor as well. There's been calls for police reform. And what remains to be seen is exactly what that looks like on a political and legislative scale. But as we know, everything that happens politically and legislatively ends up affecting things educationally. So my first question, I guess, when you consider if there is reform to be done based around punitive actions and contact, how does that manifest itself in schools? And so my first question was, in lieu of the push for reform in policing, how should the emphasis for alternative interventions and redirection be reflected in schools so that decreasing suspensions is only the first step towards more effective support for students? In other words, many schools have already been mandated in years past to decrease the amount of out-of-school suspensions. But as any administrator who is sitting in this room can tell you, anybody who is engaged in data can tell you that there are ways around that. And schools utilize different tools and techniques to avoid the negative stigma of being a suspension station. So how do we make sure that these calls for better interventions by police, how do we make sure that it rolls down to affecting students?
Quan, can I jump in on that one?
Yeah, man. Go ahead, bro.
All right. When I saw that Brother Wallace that came up with this question, man, I thought that it was very timely because in some of my circles, my peer group, we had already began to have this conversation, and we framed it around what is the educational equivalent to police brutality. And in many regards, it is the disproportionality in suspensions for minority students, namely African Americans. So the point that Brother Wallace brings out in this question is, what can schools do? What will districts do in lieu of suspensions? And Quan, you were one of the first people, man, years ago when we sat down and do some work with the think tank that talked about doing away with suspensions. Yeah. And I remember you distinctly said, we're not doing away with discipline, but how we discipline and how we manage those incidents is what we're going to do. So we're going to bring in some alternatives. I think that any school that sets out, or any district that sets out to reduce suspensions, can't just have the goal to reduce suspensions. You have to have a program. You have to have a format. You have to have a process that you follow. Okay, what are the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5? And what's the subset of step 1? What's the subset of step 2? So on and so forth. So, and one of the other topics that I see we're going to discuss later is, how do you bring in or recruit more social workers, more climate and culture coaches, etc.? That's the answer. There have to be some alternatives to suspensions. There have to be some cultural awareness raised with the staff members that work with students, so that everything that happens is not a suspendable offense. Everything that a kid says, even though it may be insubordinate or disrespectful, how do we teach? How do we coach? How do we redirect? And as a last resort, how do we then suspend? And when we do suspend, how do we do that with dignity? How do we still have that be a teachable moment? What does that readmit conference look like? What does that conversation with the student look like at every step of the way? What does that conversation with the parent or the guardian look like once that student is readmitted? Who do we pair that student with? What resources can we bring in? So I won't be very long-winded, but I think that's a very good topic because as we look at what's going on in America, how we respond to that and address that in schools is only a stone's throw away. So we can't wait for legislation. We can't wait for the answers to come to us. We have to be proactive and on the front line and thinking about what will the fall look like for our students. And as some of my parents said, not what will the fall look like, what does right now look like? Yes, school year just ended. We have a long summer ahead of us. Yes, everyone is preparing for the fall, but what services and resources can a school or district provide now to address these concerns?
I think that what's going to be a constant theme, I think, through this discussion is the role of the school building, the role of the staff in that school building. And what we're going to see is that schools are a part of the community. If they're not seen as being a part of the community, I feel that we would literally fall victim and figuratively fall victim to what the African proverb says. And the African proverb that we talk about a lot that kind of sparked, my mission in being a teacher is that if the young men or the young people are not initiated or they don't feel like they belong in the village, they'll burn it down just to feel it's warm. And so I think that, if the school does not change the way that we view schooling or the way that we view education, because right now education is very invasive, right? We're invading the community. The people who are inside of the building, they're not necessarily for the community, so they come in invading, and education is something that they do to the community. I'm about to do this to the community, right, with no community input. So I'm invading the community. I'm giving you something that you might not necessarily want, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is going to cause a feeling of not belonging, right? Not only among the students, but among parents and community members as well. And so as a result, I think that, we have to approach education as we are, schools, teachers, staff, we are a part of the community. And that means that a lot of community input, a lot of community research, from the way that we discipline to the way that we educate. And so I think at the top of everything is that building that community, building that sense of belonging, because that's one of the main things that, when we talk about getting rid of suspensions, is to increase that sense of belonging. Because if I'm telling a student that may have some problematic behaviors or some that I view as problematic behavior, the worst thing we want to do is say, hey, I don't want you, I need you, I'm gonna kick you out of school. That doesn't promote a sense of belonging. And so that's going to be one of the biggest issues as we move forward during this time. That how do we foment that feeling of belonging amongst our students and amongst our families as well.
And in a culture that's responding to a pandemic where
Right.
physical and social closeness is going to be affected as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things that come to mind, just like from practical standpoint, right? I think, if some of that budget that was used to spend on the police that actually work in the schools would be used to create positions for some of the fathers in the community, kind of come in and have the presence, right? Like kind of using the InDemand model, right? It's like, I think a big part of it is if, we were able to find dollars to like actually cover the cost of somebody committing their time and their energy there. I think having somebody there that's just as likely to give you a hug when you do something well, it goes a lot farther. As I think about myself as a young man, right? Like I really wasn't trying to listen to you and if I didn't know if you cared or not, right, I would just try to avoid you, right? So like the suspension is cool, but like, when I remember, growing up as a teenager, there was a man on our street, on one street that I lived on, and we flocked to his home when he was off work, right? Because he would just mentor us, just talk to us, right? So there's the thought of like having that as an option or as an alternative. I think that you'll find some of those folks that take those suspensions as, some of the young folks that take the suspension as a vacation, they might miss having that person that they interact with that's there. So I think just a practical approach might be just taking some funds and putting it towards that and creating a space for people that would desire to be there but just can't afford to commit that much amount of time there.
Absolutely. And then when we're thinking about, just like DeJuan said, the funding is important because we have to, hold the people who hold the strings accountable and help them to understand that, hey, this is an integral part of investing in our children, bringing resources and bringing programs back to the school that they can learn from and be a part of. And that takes money and that takes effort, So the big thing about InDemand is, once again, when we're challenging Black men to step up, like he alluded to, and getting those bodies into the school is going to take some effort, some initiative, some type of offering, so to speak. It shouldn't, but let's keep it practical. We have to cover those costs, and we have to have some type of incentive to try to get those people in there to try to make that change.
You set a blueprint already, Quan. And Ferg and I, when we were working together, we modeled what we did based upon that blueprint that you set, and it works. I'm happy to report it works. Mm-hmm. And it's community time. I remember you said, these were your words, not verbatim, but in general. Two things happen when you involve the community. Students begin to see the community as a place that they can go for refuge, and the community begin to see the students as assets and not liabilities. So when you invite, you would do community time. And we did community time for a summer, and we piloted it, and it works. You would do community time. You would do circles. You would start the day with that community time circle where you just kind of set the tone and set the intentions for the day. And the other piece of that, you would invite community members in to be speakers for community time. I remember you invited me in to be a speaker for your school, and I invited you in to be a speaker for my school. And you just dropped those seeds of knowledge. And it's nothing that precludes or prevents us from inviting the police officers in to be a part of community time so that they begin to see our students and our students begin to see them. And it becomes a community as it was intended to be. So I just want to uplift that, man. The blueprint is kind of out there. Community time, and, you know, maybe when we're offline, we can kind of share what that schematic looks like, but, you know, it works. And I think it'd be very beneficial.
Yeah. And I mean, and I think, you know, and like some of the goal is that when we start talking about, of course, we know the statistics about how Black students, particularly Black boys, tend to be recommended for suspensions more, expulsions more than their white counterparts. And so the issue is, you know, what I've seen is there's a bias. You know, sometimes this bias plays itself out, and you know, we see how it plays itself out, and you know, when it comes to police interactions with Black people, but it also how educators and how school staff interacts. You know, because oftentimes, you know, we look at you know, sometimes the things that we think, the baggage that we come into the school with, it impacts the way that we treat and what we believe about our young people. You know, whether it is they're troublesome, or whether it's about their intelligence. You know, and you know that bias has to be challenged. You know, and so I think, you know, really creating that sense of belonging, really creating that sense of community like we talked about, it would cause us, the adults, to kind of check our bias first, you know, at the door, and really being honest, like, you know, with ourselves, like, all right, what bias do I have, you know, and how can I, you know, get over that? How can I rethink my stance for the betterment of young people?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So along those same lines, we all spoke about this new framework that has to be put into place with regard to getting more, and I hate when people say getting more bodies in school, because that's the last thing we need is more, you know, people who are just taking up space.
Yeah.
We need people who are intentional. We need people who are trained. We need people who are loving. We need people who are successful in delivering content to our students, as always, but also delivering love to our students. However, there was a report today that came out in the Free Press that said that schools are looking at a $1.2 billion budget cut in lieu of these new services, in lieu of this new paradigm that is happening within education. And without there being a significant overhaul of that situation in that process, a lot of the things that are attempted to be put into place will be for naught. But when we talk about what's happening in the schools, I guess my question is, as we look at putting more people into place and providing the support for people in the school currently to make this transition, what can be done to support the recruitment of more counselors and social workers into the field and into the schools, but what also can be done to support the development of those who are in the schools to prepare them for this shift that is happening? Again, the perfect storm of a global pandemic, which is a macro level problem, and a very, I would say that police reform and the connections between races is also a macro level problem too, don't get me wrong, but they're both acting on children at the same time. So what can be done to support the development and recruitment of not only those who are in the schoolhouse as we speak, but those who we wish to recruit to be able to come into the school to do this work? And that includes brothers who would be related to the InDemand program.
Hey, you know what? Can I jump on this one too, Quan?
Please, bro, it's open.
All right. So, two very distinct concerns, and both are very timely. I think it needs to be an all-out blitz, a call to action, if you will, to quote one of the lyrics from the InDemand song and the movement that we have coming up in a couple of weeks. It has to be a call to action, because this is the moment. People are galvanized right now. People are energetic right now. And I think the educational profession has to capitalize on that, because there is a shortage of teachers, particularly a shortage of minority teachers, particularly a shortage of African-American males in this profession. But people are inspired right now. So to not capitalize on that, I hate to say it, there needs to be marketing specifically for people who want to get in and make a difference. Mm-hmm. You know, I can recall a few years back, an incident that occurred in Dallas, where the then Dallas chief of police, who was an African-American man, said, if you all want to make a difference, sign up to be an officer. You know, we could use you and your mindset on the front line to support these communities. Same thing with education. If you want to make a difference, sign up to be a teacher. We could use you on the front line. Sign up to be a social worker for schools. We could use you on the front line. And the other piece about the training, I think districts have to be committed to addressing the elephants that are in the room, and there needs to be more culturally responsive training that's not necessarily optional, but an expectation. You can make optional training optional all day long, and people will opt out to receive that training. But if we recognize this as a pandemic educationally, as we have the COVID-19 pandemic in the medical field, then it needs to be a call to action for districts to respond to address the needs. We do see disproportionality in data. We do see certain sections of kids or students, particularly students of color, suspended at an absorbent amount, that outpaces. Students in many districts that are African-American are suspended at rates greater than what they populate. The inverse of that is students in many districts that are African-American represent honors classes at a rate significantly less than what they populate. There has to be culturally responsive training for staff members to be able to address the needs that kids have. If there is a gap, remediate that gap, support those students, reduce suspensions, not just by looking away, but by bringing in programs to help address those needs, and also to identify students who do have the educational acumen, the academic acumen, to be in these honors classes so that they can make a difference academically as well.
Yeah. And I think, simply put, we are in a time period that has exposed a lot of things. This is a time period that will be in the history books, that will forever change the way that we view everything, right? So, especially in education. And so I remember some of the things that you were talking about, Kente, just offline, was that, and Ross and Rod, was that if anything, this shows just how crucial schools are. Schools have been responsible for feeding students, for trying to figure out a way to still educate despite distance. And we saw every day that those involved in education were doing things above and beyond what they're called, their job duties pretty much. And so, with that being said, is I totally agree with you, Rosser. The messaging is that teachers are revolutionaries. We're on the front lines. Frederick Douglass said that it's easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men. So if that's the case, that means that the brunt of our work to build a better world is going to happen with our young people. And just so happen that our young people, one way or the other, whether it's during the pandemic or whether it's without a pandemic, they are under the net of some type of school or education system. And so, with that being said, I foresee that there's a fervor right now where people want to get involved. We see the people marching the streets, people trying to figure out, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And being involved in education is that answer, I believe. Again, whether it is some of the whether being a teacher, a counselor, social worker, but also being a volunteer and a mentor as well. It takes time and it takes sacrifice. But if that revolutionary spirit is out, that momentum is out there, I totally agree with Kente. Like, we have to take advantage of that and say, hey, that energy, that fervor that you have, it can be galvanized and it can be used in in this realm of education. And so, you know, getting that message out that teachers are revolutionary. This is this is one of the fronts. Be on the vanguard, be on the front lines in this work. And I think that, you know, it's a very fulfilling occupation, but it also those who never thought to be involved, you know, at all at this time, they're looking to be involved. And, you know, to be able to put up that mantle of, you know, be involved in education. This is something that teachers, other teachers, as well as the education system itself, has to put out. You know, I know, you know, with the money side, you know, I know that there's a couple school districts that are, you know, like up in the starting pay for new teachers and things like that. So, you know, that's a good step in the right direction, you know, but beyond the pay, that whole, like, hey, you know, teaching is revolutionary, you know, that whole message definitely is timely and definitely needed to be put out right now.
I agree. And capitalizing off what you were talking about and what Kente was saying about culturally responsive teaching is the fact that, you know, we have to continue this because once again, we use this as an opportunity. We have to seize this opportunity to shine the light on the oppressive tactics that have been utilized on every front. You know, when we're talking about education, when we're talking about health-wise, when we're talking about, you know, the standard of living, we have to incorporate that into everyday, as he said, culturally responsive or culturally relevant teachings and train the teachers in that aspect so that students can see the direct correlation to how this impacts their life, you know, and how it impacts their standard of living to a certain degree. So that has to be something that's normed across the board.